Hi y'all, I've got a modern classic for you today. Dragonflight by Anne McCaffrey. This is the first in the wildly popular Dragonriders of Pern series. So this is going to be both a spoiler and non-spoiler review. I will do the non-spoilery bits early, and then I will give you fair warning before I do any spoiler bits so that you can skip ahead. I'll give you the timestamp so you can skip ahead to just the final wrap-up. But there are definitely some things I need to talk about in this book that will have spoilers in it, but I'll give you some fair warning first. So, I had never heard about this book until I wrote my debut, which is The Last Dragon Princess. A lot of my early reviewers were comparing it to Anne McCaffrey's book, if not in plot, then at least in feel, and so I decided I better check it out. This was published in 1968, and historically is a very important book in the world of both science fiction and in fantasy. I have some notes. I had never read any Anne McCaffrey up to this point, but I recognized the name because my sister is a big fan of hers. So I called her up and asked if she had the book, and if so, if I could borrow it. In addition to that book, my sister lent me her entire Anne McCaffrey collection. Thanks, sis. So Anne McCaffrey is a very prolific author, and after Dragonflight won her both the Hugo and the Nebula Awards, making her the first woman to do so, she spawned the Dragonriders of Pern series into a 25-plus book saga. And I say 25-plus books. It's somewhere between 25 and 35 books. There are a number of spin-off series and multiple timelines. After her death, her son Todd McCaffrey took over the franchise. So I'm not sure what books are the Dragonriders of Pern and what books are other dragon stories. It's somewhere between 25 and 35. It's a lot of books. Also, Warner Brothers has optioned the Dragonriders of Pern storyline from the Anne McCaffrey estate, so we may be seeing a potential movie development there. So, in a nutshell, this is a story about a bunch of dragon riders who have seen their numbers decrease over the previous centuries, but the planet is coming upon a time of danger where these, they're called strings, are going to be attacking the planet from the sky. Their planet is moving into a dangerous part of their planet's rotation, and the strings are going to fall from the sky and cause mayhem. The dragon riders and the dragons themselves are the planet's best defense against these strings, but there is only one queen dragon left. The queens are the only dragons who can lay eggs that will make more dragons. The other females are sterile. And that queen has now died, but before she died, she laid a queen egg, so they know there's going to be a new queen dragon, and they're going to need a new queen dragon rider for her. So the male dragon riders go out into the population to try to find a woman who will be a good fit to bond with the new queen dragon that's about to hatch. Each dragon in this world has a corresponding rider. At the time of their hatching, they form a telepathic bond with this person. The dragons themselves are intelligent, but not very good at planning things or at seeing the bigger picture of what's going on. So they need the humans, with their telepathic bonds to each dragon, to direct their energies into something productive, like saving the planet. The dragon riders are basically the dragon handlers. This book mostly concentrates on Lizza, who is chosen as the new baby queen dragon's rider. And it follows her experiences as she is chosen by the other dragon riders, as she meets the newly hatched dragon queen for the first time, and as she integrates herself into this new society of dragon riders.
Get it?
Got it.
Good.
So this was an interesting book for me to try to review. I'm a regular reader of both science fiction and fantasy, but I tend to pick up more contemporary works. This was written in 1968. This book was a trailblazer, and it was very much ahead of its time, and it did some things that no one had ever seen done in popular fantasy before. Even though this is marketed as a fantasy, it's really a science fiction. It's a typically fantasy world with, dragons, but the world building is scientifically based, very similar to my own book. And this was something that no one had seen done before, so it was definitely ahead of its time. There are also a number of tropes used in this book that as a 2019 reader, I found to be overdone and trite and predictable as heck. I knew how this book was going to end by the time I was about halfway through it, and I was exactly right. But to be perfectly fair, this book started those tropes. So the good first. The world building in this book is vast, it is complex, it is nuanced, and it is exceptionally well done. What we see is a fantasy setting with a science fiction world building structure. Something that was very new and had not been done before, or at least had not been done in a popular novel before. If this book is not the mother of the science fiction and fantasy crossover genre, then it's the first book to popularize the concept of slashing both science fiction and fantasy into the same world. The story also features some large world-scale problems mixed in with court politics, which I'm a big fan of. The pacing is moderate but consistent, and overall it's a fun ride. As for the things I didn't like, it took me a good 30 to 50 pages just to get my head wrapped around the grammar. It's definitely written in a very classical fantasy style. The grammar is a bit wonky, and it took me a while to be able to translate it into my head. But after the first 50 pages or so, I was able to run with it without a problem. To give you an example of this from the first page. Then, forcing herself to relax, muscle by muscle, joint by joint, she tried to feel what subtle menace it might be that could rouse her, yet not distress the sensitive watchwear. Another thing I was shaky on is there is a large vocabulary to learn about this world. And by large, I mean there's a 15-page index at the end for all the new terminology and all the different jobs and craftsmen and all the new words you got to learn in this book. And it doesn't ease you into it. You're expected to just use the index. So from page 1, you're thrown into this whole new vocabulary. And honestly, if I hadn't had a reader who had gone through the entire Pern series and was able to throw out a word and be like, what was this? Oh, this was this and that. Okay, if I hadn't had them sitting right next to me during most of my reading, I probably would have DNF'd it. But fortunately, I did have that experienced reader who was able to translate the text for me. One of my major issues was with the romantic subplot in this book, and I will get into that detail more in the spoilers section. So now I'm going to get into some spoilers. If you don't want that, then go to this timestamp and you can see my overall wrap-up review.
Danger, Will Robinson! Danger! No, Will Robinson! Danger!
You've been warned.
So the romantic subplot is problematic at best. It's a mess. It's a mess. So there's an initial flirtation between Lizza and one of the bronze male dragon riders. His name is Flar. Like I said before, each dragon rider forms a telepathic bond with their dragon. This bond is strong enough to communicate in full sentences and in some pictures and things of that nature. Emotions are also shared in the telepathic bond, along with some instincts, and this allows the riders to more effectively use their dragons in the fight against the strings. All this is great so far. So after 2 years in the wear, Lizza's dragon becomes sexually mature, and she goes on her first Dragonflight to pick a mate. There are 7 male dragons who are all eligible for the job, and the way the species works is the female dragon flies as far and fast as she can, and the strongest male dragon is the one who catches her. The longer the queen dragon's flight, the more eggs she is apt to produce. Lizza's job is to keep control of the queen and keep her flying for as long as possible so that the wearer will get as many eggs as possible and increase their ranks as much as possible. This is all fine. This works in the world building. It works with the characters. It works. When the male dragon catches the queen dragon in mid-flight, however, the telepathic bond shared by the 2 riders also connects, and Lizza and the male dragon rider end up having sex in the middle of this whole wear ceremony. That actually didn't bother me too much because it works in the world building, it works with the characters, and it was more of a got caught up in the moment sort of thing. It was a remarkably dickish move that no one told Lizza to expect this, when all 7 of the male dragon riders knew what was going to happen, and at least one of the female dragon riders from one of the sterile females also had regular access to Lizza, also knew what was going to happen, and also didn't tell her what to expect. Massively dickish move. It was also a really stupid move because the surprise of what was happening almost caused Lizza to lose control of her dragon mid-flight, which would have put the entire wear in jeopardy. So it was both a dick move and a stupid move. So anyway, after this mating flight, whatever male dragon was chosen by the queen, by tradition his rider becomes the new leader of the wear. And also by tradition, Lizza is expected to become his mate. She clearly does not consent to this, does not want it, and no one gives a shit. Now, to the book's credit, it doesn't linger on this aspect of their relationship, but it does spell it out pretty clearly. From page 152. He caught her arm and felt her body tense. He set his teeth, wishing, as he had 100 times since Ramath, the queen dragon, rose in her first mating flight, that Lizza had not been virgin too. He had not thought to control his dragon-incited emotions, and Lizza's first sexual experience had been violent. He had been a considerate and gentle bedmate ever since, but unless the dragons were involved, he may as well call it rape. Now, that passage is from his perspective. This is not just a floating narrator. He knows what he's doing. He knows it's wrong. He chooses to do it anyway. This colors so much of the book. This makes it really hard for me to like Floor, even though I liked him before this point, and he does a lot of good for the wear after this point. And yet, I can't trust him. And neither can Lizza. The text does make it clear that he has some level of affection for her, but he doesn't act like it. Lizza is very much a means to an end for him. One of those ends is gaining control of the wear. The other end is his own sexual gratification. The wear is a very sexually active place. He had women in his bed before this, and he kicked them out once his dragon mated with the queen. It's not like he didn't have options, but this is the path he chose to take because traditionally this was her job, and he's going to demand that she does it. This also massively colors Lizza's character for me, because from this point on, I don't know how much of her actions and reactions are her character, and how much of it is simply a survival mechanism for dealing with this hell that she's now living in. Not to mention the very real knowledge that her dragon is going to rise to mate again many times over the course of her lifespan. There is no guarantee her queen will choose the same male dragon each time, and there is a very real chance that Lizza herself will get passed around the wear like some dirty magazine at a frat house. So from this point on, I really wasn't able to connect with either Floor or Lizza. Now, Lizza becomes very protective of Floor and very protective of her queen's relationship with Floor's male dragon. And the reader is clearly supposed to interpret this as Lizza developing romantic feelings for Floor and being protective of her claim on him. But honestly, I read this as a survival mechanism, because now Lizza is trapped in an environment where people are purposefully withholding information from her in order to achieve her compliance in whatever they need her to do, because she is simply a means to an end to them. And any new violation can occur at any time, and has. She doesn't know what to expect next. So I interpreted this very much as a survival mechanism on Lizza's part, and not as any sort of legit romantic subplot. There are some nice character arcs that wrap up at the end, but this is clearly a romance that's supposed to span a number of books, and I'm not sure I can ever buy it as legitimate, considering all of that.
Let's face it, none of us are ever going to have a happy, normal relationship.
We're doomed.
Yeah.
The other main problem I had was me as a 2019 reader, and it has nothing to do with the text itself, written in 1968. The main plot centers around a lot of time travel. There's a lot of time travel ex machina going on in this book.
This whole thing is a circle, but not a real circle, more like a freaky circle.
Coming from a 2019 reader, it's extremely predictable and massively overdone. But like I said, that's not the book's fault. This book invented timeline ex machina tropes. It wasn't until the 1980s, when both The Terminator and Back to the Future did so well at the box office, that time travel as a storytelling trope came into the public consciousness and became popular for storytellers. This was a solid 15 years ahead of its time and invented a lot of these tropes, and may very well have inspired those iconic movies. There were a few plot holes with the female dragons that bugged me, but nothing really major. Basically, the whole reason that most of the female dragons are sterile is because they eat this firestone, which allows them to breathe fire. There makes a chemical reaction in their stomach, which is all actually kind of cool. That's the sci-fi part. And allows them to breathe fire and combat the strings. However, in the world of the book, it had been several generations since anyone had used the fire stones. So, in my mind, the female dragons haven't used the fire stones. They should be fertile. So why is it such a big deal that the queen was born? I've been told by my sister that this gets explained in later books, so whatever. I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to rate this book. Just coming into it as a 2019 fantasy and science fiction reader, this is more of a 2, maybe 3-star book. But given the historical context, and I can't ignore the historical context of this book, and I can't not give it credit where credit is due, it bumps it up more into a 4-star read. If this is a book you've been meaning to pick up, if this is a book you've been interested in reading, do pick it up. It's not a bad read. The world building is fantastic and so vast, and I loved that. But know that there are a number of tropes that you've seen before, and that's not the book's fault. The book invented these tropes, so don't hold it against it. That's all from me today. Talk to me in the comments. Have you read Dragonflight by Anne McCaffrey? If not, do you want to read it now? Would you be interested in seeing Warner Brothers develop a movie from this storyline? I'd love to hear from you. So until then, bye-bye. Ugh. Yeah. My sister, can you see that? Talk to me in the comments. Have you read the Dragonriders of Pern? Dragonriders. Oh God, I can see the spoofs. That's not pretty. Lizza becomes very protective over the male lead after the... What is his name? Just FYI, these are some of the worst covers I have ever seen.